Welcome on into the Third Down Analysis podcast. I'm your host, Danny Jackson, founder of thirddownanalysis.com. And today, I've got Ben Dennett. He has been one of my best friends, and he was probably one of my first friends. He's also one of the smartest guys I know about sports. He's sponsoring his, well, not sponsoring, but he's wearing his minor league baseball shirt today. Yeah, the Akron Rubber Ducks, which I didn't realize that was a minor league baseball team until you told me.
Yeah, you have to Google to get to some of the better team names. Rubber Ducks is definitely up there. But yeah, I think I was 4 when we met. Now we're almost 40. I think they call that an order of magnitude. That's fun.
Yeah, he's also a mathematics teacher, and so he's got the math worked out really well, right? 2 plus 2 still equals 4, as far as I know. They say math has changed these days, but as far as I know, 2 plus 2 still equals 4. And then
Just keep telling yourself that.
yeah, exactly. So Ben and I we won't get into all of our growing up sports traditions we had growing up. There were many great ones, but I love the analysis that he puts together. I love the analysis you put together, Ben. And we got talking a little bit about some things we'd be chatting about when I had you on here. And one of them was college football playoff. And so today we're going to talk through college football playoff. And you did. I'll what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the screen and we'll walk through. If you're on YouTube, you'll see the screen. If you're on podcast, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, we'll walk you through. But you did a simulation and you did some historical research on the college football playoff and then some forward-looking projection. And so I'd love to have you walk through it and explain, if there's something that I didn't quite capture there, and simply have a conversation because I went through what you put together and I think it's really good, really insightful, and had some. Oh, that's interesting. I'm going to ask Ben about that when we get to that part. So, anything you want to say before I kick that in?
No, that's a good setup. Thank you. Yeah, I think the big question, right, is like no matter how you do the end of season stuff, someone's always left out, right? If we do 2 teams, there's a third team. There's 4 teams, there's a fifth team. Now we're gonna have a 12 team playoff. Who's gonna be 13, 14? What's that gonna look like? And then, in terms of all the conference realignments, how does that fall? How does that fit into the new 12 team playoff? How are teams going to have access? And so I think that was kind of what I was looking through as I was looking through some historical trends.
Yeah. Okay. This was not this is an off the cuff question, but one I just thought of.
But shoot,
Yeah. Is there a number that you would say absolutely at this point, like no more playoff expansion? And we might have already passed that, but I'm just curious to know, like, do you think we should get to 16? Do you think we should get to 24? Should we get to 64 or 68 and do something like basketball, which I know it's completely different, but I'm just curious to get your read on the situation.
yeah, I think it depends, where you're at. I think if you're a SEC Big Ten fan, you want to consolidate. I think if you're Big 12 ACC G5, then you want to make it as big as possible, or figure out your own thing. I, People only throw it around jokingly, but the relegation systems from European soccer, like, are starting to look more and more practical and things like that. But just in having grown up in like a bowl culture where bowls mattered a lot, teams finish at the beginning of December and then they had a month to prepare. 12 teams seems like too much already, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I've been trying to think through. You mentioned bowl culture. I've been trying to think through, and I don't have anything yet. But what could college football do? And we won't talk about this now, but if you have any thoughts, great, but we'll move forward. But I've been trying to think through what can college football do to still keep bowls relevant. And I haven't landed on something yet. That doesn't mean I don't think they can, like they can't do anything. But I've seen some proposals to say to bring them to the beginning of the season, and like the following season, for instance. So you qualify. I think if you incentivize, I mean finances. I don't know how much finances they kick in now, but if you could increase the amount of financial benefit that you get, if you could award that team with some kind of summer benefit or something, more practices. I'm not sure, but anyways, I'm with you that I think
I'm
bowls.
not, yeah, I'm not strong on my portal rules and NIL rules and stuff like that, but it seems weird that the portal's open during the season essentially.
Yeah,
So if they could adjust that, that would seems helpful for bowls.
yeah. I think Joel Klatt explained it like that would be like having the NBA or the NFL do free agency during the playoffs. Like it's pretty
Exactly.
bizarre.
Yeah. That's what it feels like. Yeah, absolutely.
So, anyways, when they say who's running this ship, like there's no one that's running the ship, which is why we have free agency during the playoffs. So, okay, well, I'm gonna share my screen and we will go through it. Let's see if I can. Okay, here we go. All right, you got visual, Ben?
I do.
Okay,
Copy.
a copy. Awesome. All right, so I'll just let you walk through. Um, I'll navigate as you indicate, and then I'm gonna interrupt with some questions as you go.
Yeah, let's keep it cash.
All right.
Yeah, so it's, as you mentioned, I'm a math teacher. I'm a data guy. Nothing serious going on here, but it's like, can we look to some relics, some archaic history as a way to kind of predict what the playoffs going to look like this year? So there's three ideas I kind of had. The first thing I thought of is, we had this 14 playoff for the last 10 years. And so, some conferences were more effective at seizing those four spots than others, and kind of look at that history and see, if we project, four team onto 12 team, what does that look like? The second idea is, this whole time during the college football playoff, they've been doing top 25 rankings. So we have like an idea of who the top 12 would be. I guess it'd really be like the top 11 without the group of five team. It's not super useful just because like after the top four, it was kind of like for feelings, right? Like if you're eighth or if you're seventh, it didn't really matter because the New Year's Six bowl games are more conference affiliated. But that's an interesting way to kind of see what one for one what the top 11 looks like. And then yeah, simulation's not it's not the best word. We're not making the computer run numbers or anything. But if we take ESPN's way to where the top 25 and we say every team beats every team on their schedule that's ranked lower than they are, who has what record, who's likely to get a playoff spot, and that's what would that decision making process look
Yeah, what I like about this simulation method here is it's while it's not the 1,000 simulations where you're inputting thousands of data points in there, it, it's it's a very straightforward simulation, and I think one that makes sense and it's explainable. I think sometimes the computer simulations, while I love them, sometimes they're a bit of a black box to understand and to explain. So I think this is really accessible, which is good.
yeah, and we're not trying to decide who the best team is. We're just trying to imagine what it would look like,
Yep.
conference breakdown and stuff.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, and maybe before we dive into the 14 college football history, your listeners and viewers will be familiar. Before we had a 10-year run of the bowl championship series, right, where we had speaking of simulations, We had a series of computer rankings that would pick the top two teams at the end of the year. Um, we had in 2003, we had USC, who was number one in both human polls, not make the BCS championship game. In 2011, we had Alabama lose to LSU, and then LSU won the SEC title game, and then Alabama jumped two one-loss conference champions to make the national title game. Um, and so, the rally call was, let's win it on the field. Let's stop letting the computers win it, and then that's how we got to where we have been the last 10 years, which has been this college football playoff. I guess one more note on the BCS. So in so SEC had a team 10 of 15 years in the BCS title game, but they had a team every year for the last 9 years. And
of
so,
the BCS.
correct, yeah. So
Okay.
starting in 2006. So I guess that's 7 years. That's 7 years. Anyways, yeah, starting in 2006, SEC like always had a team championship game. And so historically thinking, I, it doesn't feel like the SEC was always the main conference, but if you were to kind of start to figure out when that happened, really you'd look at like when the big ESPN contracts came out. But 2006 is when they really kind of grabbed a hold of a lot of the stuff. And I think in some ways the college playoff was kind of a reaction. We don't want the SEC to control everything. We want to be done on the field, right?
Oh, okay.
So,
I gotta interject here for a second.
please.
So you bring up that point. I was looking at that recently to see how much the SEC had been in the playoff, and I think when I was looking at your deck, I thought about that. And here's a question for you: does the SEC have the brand it has? Like, if we were to replay the last 18 years, basically however long Nick Saban was at, 15 years, however long he was at Alabama, 17 years. If we were to replay that without Nick Saban in the equation, does the SEC evolve into the juggernaut it is today? I mean, it was a very good conference because you had like 2006, 7, 8. You had Urban Meyer's Florida team. LSU was good through the 2000s. Auburn was good, but uh, I've wondered, and knowing that you have enjoyed Alabama football in the past, I'm curious to get your perspective on if he wasn't in the equation, if the SEC still would have gone on this run, like you said, of 7 BCS appearances straight, and really being uh, maybe the reason why this college football playoff was created.
I think so. I think I think there's just like a lot of depth, like you mentioned, right? If you think about New Year's Six games, you'd say New York, but NY. Um,
Let's rebrand it.
but
Why not?
yeah,
We're rebranding
you
everything
know,
nowadays, so
Old Miss is on a run right now. Like you said, Florida had a run, Auburn had a run, LSU, right? So you have, of course, Georgia and Alabama, as you said. And so you have 5, 6, 7 teams that are like consistently in the top 10. Not consistently, but they all kind of have had their turn. And so in the, relative to Nick Saban, if Alabama wasn't first, there's always going to be someone in first. As we move into this era of the college football playoff that we'll talk about in a second, the SEC champion gets the number one seed 7 of the 10 years. So, and it's not, it's Alabama a handful of those times, but it's also LSU and Georgia. And so, whoever's number one's number one. Obviously Alabama being good is something kind of that brings attention, and uh, it's sort of a stake in the ground for the conference. But I think the depth is what kind of brings us to this situation.
okay, okay. That's fair. I was curious to get your view on that.
Yeah. Yeah. So jumping in on the playoff. Um, So the BCS had kind of taught us that strength of schedule mattered, right? Because we had these computer polls and they're judging a lot of different things. In the playoff, the 10 years of the playoff, strength of schedule came up very rarely. But if you won your conference and you had one or less loss, then you got it essentially. We have these teams in the middle. So the first year of the college football playoff, the Big 12 doesn't have a title game. And so TCU and Baylor both have one loss. They don't play in a Big 12 title game. And four other conference champions go to the college football playoff. And so, those are two of the four teams that win their conference and have one unless they lost, don't make it. 2018, Ohio State. I think there's three undefeated teams in 2018 that get in ahead of Ohio State, and then a one-loss Oklahoma gets in over Ohio State. And then, a lot of people are going to be familiar with the Florida State situation from last year. But generally, if you won your conference and you had one or less loss, you made it in. And so, we'll look at a slide that kind of compares the conferences in a minute. But a lot of times you have a Pac-10 champion that has three losses, a
Yeah.
Big 12 champion that has two losses. And so, growing up, living in Big 12 country now, it's easy to be like, kind of besmirch it, like, oh, of course the SEC team always gets in, but the SEC team always has one loss or less.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. Okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
keep
go
going.
ahead, sorry.
I think you're going to hit this runner up here, right?
Right. Yeah. And so early on, the college football playoffs they're pretty disciplined about conference champions getting in for the first 2 or 3 years, and then they kind of go off the rails. And every year after that, a non-conference champion gets in. We have the COVID year. We have Notre Dame losing the ACC title game and getting in. We have what Michigan, Georgia, and not Michigan, Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State 2 years ago.
Oh, yeah,
Um,
yeah, you're
TCU
right.
TCU had actually lost the conference title game as well.
Yeah.
Um, and so, we have these rules with the 12-team playoff where the conference champion's going to get in. I think the 4-team playoff had those ideals, but kind of drifted from them pretty quickly.
Yeah. 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 One note, I think the 2013 TCU Baylor situation where they didn't get in, didn't that spur the Big 12, even though they had 10, to petition and appeal to be able to play a conference championship game, despite only having 10? Like there was a rule at the time, I thought you had to have 12 in a conference to play, and they petitioned to be able to get that conference championship back. I don't remember what the timing was on that, but anyways, I don't know if you remember
That
off the top
that
of your
seems
head.
about right. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I have trouble remembering exact years of when conference realignment really
Yeah.
hit its groove and stuff. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Wiki's a good source for remembering the chronological history of that. uh, okay.
but yeah, I guess yeah. Okay, here we go. So yeah, so if you have 10 years, 4 teams each year, so you have 40 spots. Um, some of the anomalies, right? So the other is one Notre Dame, and then Cincinnati, and so then one of the ACC spots is actually Notre Dame. Um, yeah, the rest, I don't know. What stands out to you when you look at this at first?
Well, I think your next slide is actually where my mind went first. Was okay.
Okay.
I look at the Big 12 because that's one of the areas that I really focus on in my coverage, and I look at the participants, and I'm thinking pretty quickly. Okay, I know Texas this last year, and then Oklahoma a number of times, and uh, they abandoned ship here for greener pastures, literally green, as in money pastures, and they so then what are you left with? And I think it's just TCU was the only program that made it into the Big 12, right? Well, I think you're going to show this here in a minute, but that's what stood out to me. And I mean, that basically leaves to me. I'll just go to the next slide, and it is.
But let's do
Oh,
you mind if we go back to the other one for
oh
just a
yeah,
second?
yeah.
So this is broken down by conference, but it may as well be broken down by team, right? Because there's these
Hmm.
I'll call them old money teams, like SEC, 8 of those 12 is Alabama, right? Big 12, 4 of those is Oklahoma, 6 of the ACC is Clemson, right? And so it's broken down, but now if you start, as you alluded to on this next slide, you start moving the old money teams, it kind of disrupts the conference.
Yeah,
Okay, go ahead.
and then the Pac-12. Obviously, it's no more, and so everything is shifting to the left here, which is SEC and Big Ten. A conversation for another day then really becomes like, are we actually going to really get to? We're almost to the point of it's a SEC Big Ten playoff, and I think a question that a lot of listeners, a lot of people out there have an assumption a lot of people make is that we're going to get to an eventual, like if I look at these numbers here in the newer alignment, we're going to eventually get to it's just the SEC Big Ten, but I'm not there yet. I don't think I'm not there yet to assume that it's going to just be SEC Big Ten, but the numbers that you've got here that project where it's going to be do not look great if you're outside the SEC and the Big Ten.
Yeah, exactly. So this is if you move, this is like not the teams in the conference they were in when they won it, but the conference they're in now,
Yeah.
right? And so as you mentioned, 2 Washington, 1 Oregon switched over to the Big Ten. All the Oklahomas and Texases right now in SEC. So the one other Cincinnati goes to the Big 12. So we have a TCU and a Cincinnati in the Big
Oh
12.
yes, thank you.
Um, but yeah, and so instead of being like, okay, SEC Big Ten is gonna have like 7 bids, which seems about right. Now we're looking at, if we round that up, that's gonna be 9 bids. Um, which, boy, that seems like a tough pill to swallow if 9 of the bids are gonna be Big Ten SEC. Um,
Yeah, because at that point, then the other three bids are um, consumed by the automatic qualifiers.
right, and you kind of think about how we talk about March Madness, and we talk about one big conferences, right? And so it's like everybody outside the SEC and Big Ten essentially becomes one big conference.
Yeah. One question I had here about Notre Dame is, uh, okay, well, I got a couple questions about Notre Dame. Do you think Notre Dame should get an automatic qualifier because of if they get a like a minimum amount of wins? I know that's an absurd idea, but just run with me here for a second.
Um, I I think the answer is yes, and because the things we love about college football is we love the pageantry and we love the tradition and we love the history. And so, there's a part of your brain that's like, oh, the four horsemen of Notre Dame in the 40s are not real relevant to this conversation. But that really just kind of takes away from the soul of the game. Like we're just, moving money around and plugging in helmets, and it becomes real kind of like a corporate, sideshow.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the soul of the game, I love to see the gold helmet running on in meaningful games.
Yeah.
And the last 10 years, so if they make it twice, that means once out of every 5 years they're good enough. I don't think that's like unfair to squeeze other teams out like once every 5 years for the sake of history and pageantry.
I yeah, and I thought I was thinking to myself that I think that they need to be in on a very regular basis. I think it's hard to justify like a 5-7 team, but I also think that uh, for reasons like you said, I know that you want the best 12 teams in there, um, and at the same time, it's always going to be subjective as to who is the best 12 teams. I think the SEC is the absolute best at branding in college football, and so there's a lot of data that backs up the fact that I think they are the best conference. I mean, they send the most players to the NFL, and I don't think NFL scouts are necessarily duped by brand, but I think that having Notre Dame in there, like you said, gives some kind of semblance of uh, of history, and it like you said, it's the gold helmet. They have some of the best uniforms, and it would feel odd to not have them in on a regular basis. And I kind of thought if Notre Dame gets to 10 wins, which isn't always easy to do, but I think if they get to 10 wins any given year, I think they have a really high likelihood of getting in.
Yeah, and I think there's kind of like an assumption in that Notre Dame's gonna play a tough schedule. And sometimes that doesn't turn out being true, and they always play USC, and so a lot of that's hinging on like if USC is really good or not. Um, but I think, you know, no, I think Notre Dame kind of does their part where they could kind of roll their schedule over and be like, hey, we're 12 and 0 every year, and they like maybe don't as much as I kind of feel like they hold up their end.
Yeah, I this is one last comment on Notre Dame. In some ways, I've thought they don't play a schedule terribly different than Ohio State or Michigan. And they've clearly they have shifted more ACC recently, so I might be thinking a little bit dated, but you could look at Clemson or Florida State, right? I think Notre Dame doesn't play a terribly different in terms of difficulty because they play a lot of Big Ten and they play a lot of ACC schools. But for whatever reason, when Ohio State goes, when they blitz the Big Ten, it's seen a little bit differently than I think when Notre Dame. They don't quite blitz now that they're not quite blitzing the Big Ten quite the same way, but it's an interesting it's interesting how Notre Dame's brand I think has it's shifted a little bit in recent years. So
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not strong on data, but it seems like yeah, both teams play like Purdue and Northwestern every year,
that
and
yeah
it seemed like for Ohio State we're just okay with it, but with Notre Dame, we're like, well, come on, Notre Dame.
yeah I think it's and maybe it's this perception of Ohio State's in a conference, so they're playing what's in front of them, and if we're being honest here, I think the Big Ten has the lowest, almost the lowest floors of like consistently across the board of the power conferences. I think the Big 12's floor is higher than the Big Ten's floor. SEC really has just got Vanderbilt, and it's like a cellar dweller. And then you got a few teams that are rotating in the bottom with them. And then the ACC's got some cellar dwellers. So I mean, this is totally a tangent now, but Ohio State gets a benefit and Michigan gets a benefit that perhaps the perception is Notre Dame gets to pick and choose their schedule. So if they're purposely choosing some of these easier guys, maybe that's seen differently than Ohio State, even though they're playing some of the same teams. So, anyways, that's just a different thought. Going to interject here something though, real quickly, Ben. Uh, I'm not currently sponsored on the podcast, so I do pun reads in place of sponsored ads. So Fourth of July is coming up here soon. So I've got a couple here for you, Ben. Whenever the dogs decide to have a Fourth of July reunion, they choose to go for a bonfire. It's not the best one I've ever had, but it's not bad.
like a bonfire? Is that a bonfire joke?
Yeah, like a bonfire. Yeah, yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
That's cool.
Uh, did you know that battery and firework were arrested and one was charged while the other was lit off?
It's a good one. Yeah,
Yeah,
that just lands well.
yeah. It was a good tangent on Ohio State and Notre Dame. So, should we go to the next slide?
Yeah, maybe it's well. Sorry, last thing on this one. Maybe it's worth noting that in this, mathematical world, the ACC does get two spots.
Yes, yeah, that's a good call. Uh, and we'll see what happens with realignment there. But they do have a couple. They have several big brands still that they, as long as they're in the ACC, they could really maximize. Uh, if Clemson was really good this year, and that assumes Florida State is as good as or pretty good again this year, and then if Miami has, a lot of people are really high on Miami. That would require, that'd be asking a lot for Clemson and Miami to come back. I wonder if they could get three teams in. I think that's asking probably too much, but it would be intriguing to see if that could happen. Okay.
Yeah, and so the second method I was kind of looking at is they do these rankings to decide the top four teams, but they don't just stop at four, right? They go all the way to 25. And so if we just looked at the top 12, who in theory would have made the playoff if we'd done a 12-team playoff for the last 10 years, then that's, it's easy one to one. Once again, as I mentioned earlier, when people were voting on the top 12, they weren't squeezing the orange. It didn't really matter if someone was 10 or 9 because the bowl would choose based on conference affiliation. And so these aren't perfect that way, but they're good for giving a bigger picture instead of
Mm-hmm.
trying to project from 4 to 12.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. I think it makes sense. So you you've got a table here that breaks out the top 12 from the last, what, 11 years, 12 or 10 years or something.
Yeah, so the 10 years of the college football playoff.
Okay. So this is interesting. So if I'm reading this table right here, you've got SEC on average had just over three teams in. Um, and this is not in 1 year. Is that correct? Oh, yeah, this is the top 12, right? Yeah, this is the top 12. Okay, I was thinking the CFP. Okay, so on average, there were three teams in the top 12 of the college football playoff rankings every year. Big Ten, just about three. Big 12, just about two. Which is interesting because Texas was likely not one of those schools for most of those years.
Right. I was surprised how many Oklahoma States there were.
Oh yeah, man,
Oklahoma
Gundy.
State had a lot of runs where they finished in the top.
Yeah, yeah, they were close this year. I mean, they were 20, so maybe not super close, but and then ACC 1.6, Pac-12 no longer. So you figure those are going to probably most of those are probably going to the the Big Ten. And what's interesting is this is interesting because at least every year the ACC and the Big 12 had a minimum of one team. And what's fascinating is the SEC. They had a year where they only had one in the top 12.
Yeah, well, it's you think we brought up the old money teams earlier, um, but there's a year where Pittsburgh is in the top 12. There's a year where
Mm,
Georgia Tech's in the top 12. Similarly with the Pac-12, there's Arizona has a few appearances. I think Colorado has one towards the front,
mm,
right? And so this is where like the effect of the old money teams kind of gets diluted a little bit.
okay.
Even that other, right? There's a lot of UCFs in there. There's
Yeah.
things like that. So
I'm actually high on
um,
UCF going forward. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in Florida, power conference, Uh, so, anyways, I'll let you keep going, but I'm high on their opportunities in the future.
Anyway, so yeah, so if we go by this, the SEC and Big Ten would average about 6
Okay.
per year. And then,
But to your
you know,
point though, you just said there are years where so if you're a Big 12 ACC school, probably not a Group of Five realistically. Like Group of Five is probably never gonna. Well, actually, here was a question I was gonna ask you: Is Group of Five? Do you think they ever have a year where they can get two schools in, or do you think that's just not even gonna be on the table?
um, don't well, so this is where I'm a little ignorant. And we can talk about this more at the end. But like the scheduling practices of each of these teams, now that these conferences are so big,
Yeah,
um, like the Big 12 is going to play 10 conference games. I don't know if that's an offensive or defensive situation, but it's just going to be hard for Liberty to run the table in their conference and then be like, look, like in our days growing up in the LAC, Colorado State would always beat Colorado, and so then if we beat Colorado State, it's like, hey,
yeah,
look, we beat a team that beat a power conference team, right?
yeah.
Or like for some reason it seemed like Air Force would play Berkeley a lot, and so like if you beat Air Force and Air Force beat Berkeley, that was something. And you just don't have those like chains, even if they're imaginary, you don't really have those imaginary chains anymore because like it's so hard to get those non-conference matchups.
It's a good. That's a good call. I also think you probably, if you're one of those schools, you have to almost run the table 2 years in a row, so that you get visibility the first year, and then the second year you say, hey, like I'm kind of a real deal, and but like you said, that's really hard to do, and they don't have the scheduling favorability this year. So okay, I think you were yeah. So you did this same look with realignment now, and
Right. So this is sliding Oregon, Washington over, Oklahoma, Texas over.
okay,
Um, so now SEC Big Ten is getting 8 teams, which the max they can get is 9, but on average they would get 8. One thing that kind of goes into this, and you talked about it in your seventh episode. You talked about like if you have a Big Ten and it goes Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, and you have a Pac-10 that goes Oregon, Washington, USC. Well, that's cool because Washington looks good as a second place team, Penn State looks good as a third place team. But then you put them all together, well, there's only one second place team, right? So now someone has to be the fifth place team. And so it feels like this is going to break at some point. Like really, the SEC and Big Ten can't average 8 teams. But this is kind of where like the schedule makers come in. We'll
mm-hmm.
get to the simulation and stuff. I think I always thought of the schedule makers as like an old man up in an attic with an abacus, like just kind of looking at records and putting stuff in. But the schedule makers are like management consultants. Like they're not messing around. They're artists.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Let's. So is this the next? Oh wait. Yeah. These are. So you've got some slides up here. I think we'll get to that in a minute. But
Yeah, we don't need to spend a lot of time on these. These are just trends. So
okay.
the yellow line is how many SEC Big Ten teams would be in the top 12. 10 years ago it was about 5 every year. And this is based on who's in the conference that year.
That year. Okay. And the trend, if you're on podcast, the trend is up and to the right, which is good for these conferences and not good for the other
Positive
conferences.
slope. Yeah.
Positive slope. Oh, there you go. There's the math. There's the math. Positive slope. Right. Let's see. And then did okay, there we go. And then with realignment, this is boy, the last 3 years. It's really, really positive slope.
Yeah. Well, even in the middle, we see years with 9. But then, yeah, like last year, 11 of the 12 teams in the playoff ranking would be in the SEC.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I think last year was a little more of an anomaly than what we'll see every year. But to your point, like that, it can happen. So Okay, so you want to walk us through the simulation now?
Yeah, so this is, after spring camp, ESPN makes a list of the way too early top 25 rankings. And so I just went through each team's schedule. I assumed if they were ranked higher, they won. So we're not talking upsets, we're not talking injuries, we're not talking all the stuff that makes the season fun and makes the season, unpredictable. We're just saying everything goes as predictable as possible. What would it look like? And then we're gonna use the rules of the playoff. So the four conference champions will get in, and then the group of five team will get in, and then kind of see how the records look and see what the decision making would look like.
I thought this was fascinating. Well, I did not realize what you're going to tell us in a minute. So let's yeah, we'll keep going.
Okay, yeah, and so this is just the rankings. Um, I don't, anything stand out to you?
A couple things I noted was that Utah is the highest ranked Big 12 team, and they're also the first, besides Notre Dame, which is number five. Utah's the highest ranked non-Power Two team, and I think a conversation for another day is the polling and way too early ranking. I think a lot of pollsters conflate where people are going to end up versus where, like, how good they actually are. um, and then there's even more kind of mixed sentiments in between. But anyways, I think these are good rankings. It's tricky when you hear different people say, I think Utah's the fourth best team. Well, they're not, but um, anyways.
Well, yeah, it's certainly, if you want to go conspiracy theory, this is where it could start. ESPN has the SEC contracts.
Oh
Look, all
yeah,
the SEC teams are good.
yeah,
Also,
yeah.
also worth noting, like just outside the top 12, NC State, and then more SEC teams.
Oh yes. There you go. Yeah, Clemson 16. Oh, Clemson. I've got my eye on them this year.
Cool. Yeah, and so here's kind of how this scheduling goes, right? Like I said, so Georgia's number one, and so obviously no one is ranked above them, so they would be picked to win every game. So good 13 now. I didn't put like a ton of thought into it, the conference title game. I just assumed that the two highest ranked teams
Mm-hmm.
would go to the conference title game. So Texas does play Georgia in the season,
Yeah,
and so they would be 11-1, go to the conference title game, lose, and be 11.
makes sense. And so here,
Yeah,
Oregon plays Ohio State, so they would lose because they're ranked four while Ohio State's two, and then Oregon would play them again in the conference title, where they would again lose 2-4. I think the methodology makes sense. Higher ranked team would always win. It's an easy way to be consistent through. And
absolutely.
okay, yeah. So I think the next slide is where you're going here, right? Or, wait,
Well,
it's
let's
actually it's the very end slide. It's the very end slide to me. That's like the money here that is says, "Wow,
okay.
this is a conundrum."
Yeah,
But
let's just point out a few things. Well, so like if these were their rankings or if these were their records, these would not be their rankings, right? So we
sure,
have
yeah,
Michigan at number 10. That's 9-3, followed by three one-loss teams, right? And so in that situation, Michigan would be moved down, right?
yeah,
I mean, shout out to Michigan for playing three top 10 teams.
yeah.
Also, you have Virginia Tech at 21, Kansas at 22, both with one loss, and so you have to think, you know, depending on the hold that SEC and Big Ten have on the media, maybe Virginia Tech and Kansas are moving up in the rankings have one loss.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but yeah, the real magic to me is we have Old Miss at 6 with one loss, Alabama with one loss, Missouri with one loss, and they're all in the same conference.
Yeah, yeah.
And so like whoever made the schedule made it so they weren't. I think Georgia's playing a lot of them, but yeah. So Old Miss plays Georgia, Alabama plays Georgia, and then Missouri plays Alabama. And so it's set up so the SEC, depending on how you want to treat Texas at 11-1, but they'll have 5 teams with 1 loss or less if everything goes chalk, which is wild. That's beautiful. Whoever nailed it, that's beautiful.
That's what stood out to me here was the number of one loss teams that we could potentially have here. And I yeah. So I think, and then those three teams you said, Ole Miss, Alabama, Missouri, 6, 7, and 8. That really stood out to me. So I think this is incredible. So
All right, so
here,
this next slide, we pull off the rankings, right? We just organize them by conference, because, like we said, the rankings would not be the same if these are the rankings. Couple ideas, shouting out the SEC schedule makers, shout out the Big 12 and ACC schedule makers as well. So the Big 12, in theory, would have undefeated Utah and undefeated Kansas State play for a conference title. Same thing, ACC, Florida State would be undefeated in conference. They would have a loss to Notre Dame. But NC State would be undefeated. And so you'd have undefeated Florida State and undefeated NC State for the ACC championship.
and Notre Dame, you've got at 12. I mean, Notre Dame's 12-0. Like they avoid
Right.
Florida. They avoid. No, they do play Florida State.
Yeah, so
But
they play Florida State and USC are the 2 toughest games.
yeah, but they avoid NC State. They avoid Clemson. So, anyways, wow.
Yeah, so starting to piece together the top 12, um, and this is where the committee could like get cute and look at best and margin of victory and stuff. But like I said, in the playoff era, the SEC champion got the number 1 seed 7 of the 10 years. So we assume SEC is going to get 1, Big Ten is going to get 2. Florida State would not be undefeated, so we'd assume Utah would get the 3 over Florida State. So we're going Georgia, Ohio State, Utah, Florida State for the top 4. Hard to imagine that an undefeated Notre Dame team gets jumped by a
Yeah,
team that didn't win its conference.
yeah,
And then the group of 5 team, we assume is going to get the 12th seed
yes,
unless someone sets the world on fire. So what do we have? We have 6 spots that are open in theory.
yeah. And then you've got the next 3 spots that would fill between SEC and Big Ten teams.
Yeah, and so this is, we're starting to take a little bit of liberties. Really hard to imagine the number 2 team in the SEC doesn't get it. And this is a little weird because both in the college football playoff and in the BCS areas, we've seen teams that lose the conference title game kind of get penalized. And
Yeah,
so when we're talking about Texas at 11-2 versus Alabama at 11-1, Ole Miss at 11-1, Missouri at 11-1, it'll be interesting to see who who the committee thinks is the second best team in the SEC based on that. But right now, just going on rankings, we'll say Texas. Same thing. Hard to imagine the SEC doesn't get at least 3 teams in. So
yeah,
Ole Miss gets in. Um, Same thing. Hard to imagine Big Ten doesn't get at least 2 teams in. You get to the third ranked, Big Ten team and 3 lost Michigan, and so we'll pause there for a second. But yeah, so I think we're kind of on pretty safe ground to this 3
you know,
spots up there. So
and you bring up something here with Texas and Oregon getting in. Now, what's interesting is Ole Miss above Oregon, but I understand the methodology of like how we got there. I think if it's going to be interesting to watch how the committee treats the loser of the conference title games. To your point, and now I think there's not a big power conference that has divisions anymore. Unless I can't remind me. You have to keep me honest. I can't remember if the ACC still off the top of my head if they've got divisions. But I thought they did away with it. So if they penalize the conference title loser, I think that's going to incentivize commissioners to say, do we keep a conference title game? Weigh the pros and cons, right? So, anyways, that's just a side note, but
yeah,
fascinating.
that's interesting. Since the conference champion gets in, you don't have to come back to the Baylor TC conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
you don't need it anymore.
yeah. So this to me was like there was the money slide here, and this is the last slide, and it's essentially there's 3 spots left, and you've got 13 teams that could be vying for that spot. And I think it's going to be well, I'll let you go from here. I've got some thoughts, but I'd love to hear your summary here.
No, like you said, this is what they'll talk about in bars for years. Um, like we said, Kansas State is undefeated until the conference title game, one loss. NC State is undefeated until conference title game with one loss. But you also have Alabama, their only losses to Georgia, Missouri, their only losses to Alabama, and then you have Virginia Tech with one loss, Kansas with one loss, Penn State. Let's see, can't remember who Penn State plays. Oh, Penn State with one loss to Ohio State, right? And so a lot of strong cases, and it's hard to imagine like not reverting to these old money conversations, right? Like it seems like in this scenario, almost a guarantee Alabama gets.
Yeah,
Now Saban's gone, whatever, whatever, but it's really hard to see Alabama.
I completely agree. I think there's three spots left. You've got to assume Alabama's in. I do think that perception at this point of the year does play into perception at the end of the year, because if you listen to most pundits that are professional, I am not a professional pundit. I'm just a hobbyist. But if you listen to most people, Penn State they say is really poised for a playoff berth, and I agree they are. Um, would they be poised over 11-1 Kansas, or a 12-1 Kansas State, or a 12-1 NC State, or an 11-1 Virginia Tech? It's that it's that's where I think that the sentiment beforehand, where there's already this built-in uh, group, I'll just call it like group think, that Penn State is it should be in. I think that actually influences perception down the road, because they get talked about like a team that should be in. And so in a situation like this, even if there's a team that I think that year was better and had a better resume that year, could fall victim to a team like Penn State, which I actually I I think if I'm singling them out because for an example, um, I think they would have a really good case to get in, and I would be okay if they got in. They're like the little brother that finally gets a shot. But it, I think that we thought it was bad with Florida State last year because it was really one school that got left out. And Georgia, I think people understood, okay, they just lost. But even then, some people thought, well, they're still the best team and somehow they're getting loose. So there's maybe two teams. But this year, what we could see is uh, all the double digit teams all being really angry that they got left out.
Yeah, and so that's part of the heartbreaking thing with Florida State, right? Was like just win all your games and you'll be fine. They win all their games. Um,
Yeah.
so now if you go undefeated, you probably make the top 12, no matter who you are. But now a lot of one loss teams are going to get in, but a lot of one loss teams are going to get left out. And so that kind of goes back to our early conversation. Like, let's say Notre Dame goes 10-2. If things play out the way they did in the simulation, Notre Dame probably doesn't get in at 10-2.
It,
But then, yeah, so I'm thinking Alabama would be pretty safe in this situation. So now we're down to two spots. Is SEC 4 cooler than Big 12 2 or ACC 2? Um, and that's you have this conversation about strength of schedule, and you kind of talked about this is where the prior rankings go. So if Penn State beats everyone and loses to Ohio State, like wherever they're at in the rankings, they probably don't drop. Because everyone's like, oh well, they lost to Ohio State.
yeah.
Whereas like if North Carolina State loses to anyone, they're out if they lose before the title game.
Ben,
And I
this is
mean,
great.
really like the best thing would be is if the Big 12 or ACC had like a 3-loss champion, and then you had like Clemson with one loss or Utah with one loss, having just lost the conference championship game.
Mm.
And then those are probably going to still bid from the SEC. But I think this starts to become an old money conversation where the teams we trust, the Alabamas, the Penn States get in. NC State probably gets left out. Realistically, probably Kansas State gets left out.
Yeah.
They probably say they had their chance against Utah. They don't have any non-conference wins. We'll probably let Penn State, Missouri, and Alabama play.
I was I forgot about Penn State here because when I first looked at this, I just went down the left and said I think it's going to be Alabama, Missouri, and LSU that get in. But I think you're right. I would actually put Penn State in over LSU. But
Yeah,
if I had to, if you said, Danny, your life depends on you forecasting perfectly what three teams here are going to be in, I would go Alabama, Missouri, and Penn State, assuming they all finish this way. I will
right.
say I actually think there's there's going to be chaos and not all these schools are going to be in this situation, but I do think there's going to be a couple schools that are not ranked right now that will find themselves in a undefeated or 1-2 loss situation, that we replace these schools, right? Instead of Arizona, it's TCU, or instead of Clemson, it's Miami or something. Yeah, but wow. Well, Ben, this is really good analysis. Any other concluding kind of thoughts that you've got?
Well, so our big, theme was how many spots are each conference going to get. So if Alabama and Missouri get in, that moves the SEC to five, and then with Penn State, the Big Ten would get three, which is about eight.
Eight.
Which is with Notre Dame getting in the most they can get in almost. No, but is the most they can get in? Is that right? No, they can get nine.
Yeah, so that'd be nine, and then we've got Big 12, ACC, and then it's conference
Oh, the
champions and
group. That's
and the
that's
group of
right. Yeah.
five. Yeah. So really, what we're saying here is eight between the Power Two, uh, plus Notre Dame. Big 12 and ACC are only getting one each.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I think is
So
plausible.
um, so really, like I was kind of saying, I think the ACC's best chance is for Clemson to have an awesome year and then lose the conference title game because Clemson's old money enough to get an outlier.
Yeah.
Um, but then you brought up the UCF game earlier. So the Big 12 has four games against the SEC this year, and so you start throwing around like, what can the Big 12 ACC do? How can we change this? Um, if let's say it's Utah, if Utah makes a run and wins a national championship, right? That definitely scores points for the conference, and that looks cool. But there's just not like a lot of opportunities during the season to show it, right? So I think UCF with Florida would be a huge one. I think the Big 12 wins is Oklahoma State against Arkansas.
Yep. Yep. They do.
Um, but other than that, if the Big 12 goes 1-3 against the SEC, then I think everyone just kind of washes their hands. So it's tough to break Big 12.
I think you're spot on. And if you're the Big 12 or the ACC and you want to get more spots in, I think it's going to be a multi-year effort, and you've got to start this year. And at the end of the day, I think performance in the playoff uh, is going to need to speak for itself. It's interesting how the TCU loss or the TCU victory against Michigan is forgotten, even though they got slammed by Georgia. And I think that TCU. There's a lot of different thoughts on that TCU game, but Ben, this was great analysis, and thank you for coming on. I hope this won't be the last time. This was the first time, but I hope it won't be the last. And I think what you put together. Oh, I got this little thing here. I think what you put together here is great. So thanks for coming on, and let's do this again.
Yeah, fun conversation. You know, I hate to decree like the two conference system, but there'll be a lot of fun games this year. It'll be fun to see,
Yeah.
you know, play
And,
Oregon in
and
September and stuff.
it will be interesting to see how it all plays out, and I'm not going to stop watching even if it's different than what I would think is best for college football. But we'll see what happens come September.
It'll
So
be fun. Thanks for having me on.
cool. All right. Well, thanks, Ben, and we'll catch you next time.